Mr. McNerney.
Thank you.
Gentlemen. The gentleman thinks he has a different calculation. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll start on the next amendment, and you go through and coordinate it with the staff, and we'll see if it's accurate. If it's not accurate, then we'll come back and address it. Mr. McNerney, you have an amendment to Title II?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer an en bloc amendment. This includes my amendment as well as amendments offered by Ms. Baldwin and Ms. Christensen.
Without objection, the two amendments will be considered in bloc. Without objection, both amendments will be considered as read, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me to offer this amendment, which promotes water efficiency, reduce water use, and consequently reduce our nation's energy consumption. The amendment I offer today is based on H.R. 2368, the Water Advanced Technologies for Efficient Water Use Act of 2009. This legislation was recently introduced by Representative Holt of New Jersey and has also been championed by Representative Miller of California. I'd like to thank both of them for their leadership on this issue and note that they are strongly supportive of my efforts to amend this legislation. The original bill also enjoys co-sponsors from both parties and a broad coalition of stakeholders. Although water use may seem to be a distinctly different challenge from energy, the two issues are closely linked. Our country uses vast amounts of water in energy production, and it uses vast amounts of energy in producing drinking water, agricultural water, and water for other purposes. For instance, in 2005, a report prepared by the California Energy Commission concluded that California uses 19% of the state's electricity and 30% of its natural gas for water-related purposes. Climate change is impacting the water supply of California and elsewhere. Reduced snowpack in the Sierras has led to a diminished freshwater supply throughout the state, and changing weather patterns across the nation pose serious threats for water use everywhere. Energy supply, climate change, and water use are closely and inseparably linked. My amendment includes provisions that will reduce water use, lessen the strain on water infrastructure, conserve energy used to pump, treat, and transport water, and encourage water conservation. Specifically, my amendment codifies the already existing WaterSense program within the Environmental Protection Agency. This program is tasked with promoting voluntary labeling of products, voluntary buildings, landscapes, and services that are water efficient and high performing. Similar to the Energy Star program, the WaterSense program is meant to ensure that consumers have information about water efficiency of the products they purchase. Empowering consumers with this information will help all of our constituents save on the utility bills and facilitate the realization of the energy and environmental goals this committee is working to achieve. My amendment is a common sense, consumer-friendly initiative to conserve water resources, which will help our country reduce energy use as well as adapt to, mitigate the effects of climate change. This initiative has broad bipartisan support. Concerning the handout, the EPA just reviewed the bill and got back with a number of technical corrections which are handwritten in on the bill. So this bill is about water conservation, and efficient water use. Water and energy are very closely related. So I encourage my colleagues to look at this bill and support it as a part of the energy bill that we're considering. With that, I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time or yields to another member?
I'm going to yield back, Mr. Chairman. I think that Ms. Christian wants to strike the last word.
Gentlelady from Virgin Islands, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment again aims to address the unique circumstances of the United States territories, which are island communities and island economies, by adding a subtitle G to Title I. If the current energy infrastructure and energy development in the territories are not specifically addressed in this bill, again, in this instance, my colleagues and I from the territories fear the underlying goals and principles of this bill will not be realized in our islands. Furthermore, the inability to attain standards contained within this bill by the territories would have a lasting negative impact on our island economies. We do not need to further the disparity in economic and energy advancement between the territories and the U.S. mainland. Instead, we should be continuing to work to reduce this disparity by providing the territories with the tools and resources needed to improve energy efficiency and to work towards greater energy independence. My amendment at its core adopts a pragmatic approach to finding a workable energy solution for our territories. This amendment is about providing our territories with the assistance to meet the standards this bill promises. This amendment would instruct the Secretary of Energy to establish an island energy independence team whose mission would be to work with local leadership to develop energy action plans for each of the territories. This team would consist of technical, policy, and financial experts that would examine the unique energy needs of each territory. The energy action plans for each territory called for by this amendment would take into account the long-term sustainability of territorial energy production and use and its intimate connection with the environment and economy of our islands. My amendment recognizes that as islands, the territories are well suited with opportunities to develop renewable and environmentally friendly energy resources, but at the same time face difficult technical and financial challenges to develop these resources. The team would seek to identify strategies to reduce the reliance and expenditures on imported fossil fuels, improve the energy efficiency of power generation, transmission and distribution, and increase consumer energy efficiency. The team would also seek to improve the performance of energy infrastructure of each territory through enhanced planning, education, and training. The resulting custom-made energy action plans that my amendment would implement would allow for the goals and visions set forth in this bill to be achieved in the territories. And I want to recognize the work of Congresswoman Bordalio of Guam and Congressman Perlusi of Puerto Rico for their work on this amendment, and I urge its adoption. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Generally yields back her time. Further discussion on these en bloc amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
could I be recognized to strike the last word on my amendment?
Generally is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that I'm offering is a result of collaborative discussions involving the NRDC, the World Resources Institute, EPA, and the Carbon Trust, and leading academics. It is aimed at addressing greenhouse gas emissions through consumer behavior, in particular by measuring and disclosing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that go into the making and use of a product. By getting this information, consumers can make informed choices about what they purchase. This would be an entirely voluntary program. I want to emphasize that point, entirely voluntary. A carbon label can be a sort of nutrition label for the environment. It allows consumers to be armed with the information they need to make a difference. Just as food labeling has changed the way we think about what we eat, a carbon label for consumer goods, including industrial products, food items, and household cleaners, will provide us with information about the energy and environmental impact of products we buy. And not only can individual behavior be influenced, but product carbon disclosure and labeling provides a unique way of addressing some of the international competitiveness issues that we've been talking about and influencing producers in China and India to monitor their emissions output. Recognizing that there are many questions about how best to measure life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, this amendment requires, as a precursor to a program, the EPA to first conduct a study into the feasibility of establishing a national program for measuring, reporting, and labeling products or materials in the U.S. for their carbon content. Further, upon conclusion of the study, the EPA is required to set up a national product carbon disclosure program, which may involve a product label. Participation, as I stressed before, would be voluntary. The product carbon disclosure and labeling concept is not at all new. The Carbon Trust in the UK has taken a lead in establishing international standards for carbon measurement. Many familiar companies are already partnering with the Carbon Trust, including Tropicana orange juice, a PepsiCo product, Walker's brand potato chips, Huggies, and Cadbury chocolates. Japan, too, is carrying out carbon footprint labels on food packaging and other products. Consumers of Sapporo Black Label beer will be told how much CO2 is emitted by the machinery used to plant barley and hops and during production and transportation, and up until the empty can is recycled. Further, the California legislature is currently considering a voluntarily carbon label bill. I just want to show, this is an example of Walker's chips. Not only do they have the nutrition labeling that we're so familiar with here in this country, but on this side we have their CO2 label, and it describes how much CO2 was emitted, everything from planting the potatoes and the sunflowers that produce the sunflower oil all the way till it can be purchased. And I want to mention, not only does this help drive consumer choices, but it does also inform manufacturers and producers so they can better understand where they can limit their greenhouse gas emissions. As in Walker's example, they learned to their surprise that transportation was actually a minor factor, but some of the practices used in the planting of potatoes extracted a higher carbon impact, and they were able to take corrective action in reduce their own carbon footprint in the production of these products by 10% just by understanding it better. So I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment and yield back my remaining time.
Yeah. Or I can ask. Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Barton.
I seek recognition. Just strike the record.
Gentleman's recognized for 5.
I feel a little bit like, Mr. Chairman, I've gone to a church bazaar and bought the mystery package not knowing what's in it.
Congratulations.
Yeah, we don't. Well, what's in it are 3 disparate amendments that have no relevance to each other than that they're all amendments to the same bill and even apparently the same title. One of them, the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, appears to correct some discrepancies in the territories, and that would appear to be something that's worth doing. Then our friend from California has offered a water rebate program that starts at $50 million a year and escalates to $150 million a year. That would, in some sectors, be a huge bill and a major debate all of its own, dealing with water and water rebates, and it's just one of the 3. And then our good friend from Wisconsin has got a voluntary carbon labeling program, which is mandated that it be studied, and if I understood her correctly, mandated that they make a decision whether to make it voluntary that people comply with it. And my question on the carbon, if we knew the carbon content, what would we know? What information does that give us? So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask for a division to divide the Christensen amendment and accept it, or let you have a separate vote, and then have a roll call vote on the divided in block amendments of Mr. McNerney and Ms. Baldwin.
Okay. Let's proceed first to vote on the Christensen amendment. All those in favor of the Christensen amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The vote now comes on the other 3.
2.
2.
2.
The other 2 unblock amendments.
Mr.
And
Chairman,
we'll proceed to a roll call
Mr.
vote.
Chairman,
there may be
Who
some
seeks
debate.
recognition? Yes.
just to bring up the point that we're going to label homes. We want to label carbon in potato chips, but we don't want to label the climate effect on energy bills.
Okay.
That's what we're saying, right? We had the chance to amend the bill last night to say, let's put in the energy bills of ratepayers what the increase to their electricity cost would be on climate. And the Republicans voted, yes, labeling's good. Democrats voted, no, let's don't label. But now we voted to label homes. We now want to label potato chips. I'm concerned about the nutrition labeling for the ratepayer. I'm concerned about the nutrition labeling for the taxpayer. When is the taxpayer going to know the cost of the increase of this bill on their electricity rates? And I would think that maybe through this process, Mr. Chairman, we could work to an agreement, if we're going to be labeling everything, that we would come to some agreement to label the electricity bill so that the ratepayer knows how much of this escalated cost will be about this legislation. And that's why I feel so strongly to speak out against labeling potato chips when we won't label electricity bills, and I yield back my time.
Like all the rest of this is.
We'll now proceed to a vote on the other two amendments in block. Mr. Barton indicated he wanted a roll call vote. We'll proceed to a roll call vote.
Right, let's think about that.
Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Aye. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez.
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee.
Aye.
Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Malison. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Mr. Hill.
Aye.
Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, aye. Mr. Space. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Shadegg? Mr. Shadegg votes no. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer votes no. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes no. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bonomack? Ms. Bonomack votes no. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, no. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan votes no. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes no. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher votes aye. Mr. Pallone? Is he still here? Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon? Aye. Mr. Green?
Aye.
Mr. Green? Aye. Mr. Rush?
Aye.
Mr. Rush? Aye. Mr. Melanson?
Aye.
Mr. Melanson? Aye. Ms. Schakowsky?
Aye.
Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Engel?
Aye.
Mr. Engel? Aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross? Aye.
No.
Anybody else? I'm sorry. Mr. Space, I'm sorry. Mr. Space, aye.
Elliot, you got to count.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Clerk will tally the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 34, the nays were 21.
34 ayes, 21 noes. The amendments are agreed to.